The similarities, though, are what we're going to kind of go through, and it comes down to, like, you have to be prepared on 3 fronts: the physical plant, the people, and the policies, right? So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the physical place. Next slide. So we know that COVID spreads in the workplace a few different ways. Person to person, perhaps most significant, respiratory droplets that linger in the air, and surfaces, touching surfaces, where somebody else who has been positive has left their COVID germs, and then touching someplace on yourself where the droplets are getting in you. Next slide. OSHA requires all employers to have a safe workplace, to furnish each worker employment and a place of employment which are free from recognized hazards that are causing or likely to cause death or serious harm. COVID falls into this. OSHA is definitely something that all employers need to be aware of. And certainly you don't want to report to COVID about your place of employment. Go ahead, next slide. The CDC has recommendations for the workplace. You should take a look at these. Make sure you're familiar with the CDC guidance for the workplace. As of May 6th, one of the things they recommend is conducting a hazard assessment of your workplace. This can be done a couple of ways. I'm hearing about professional risk management assessments, and they can be done, like your insurance companies a lot of times have risk managers on staff, your insurance agents, and they will send someone out for a really pretty reasonable price and help you with these risk assessments. But on a more even just basic level, walking your own site, looking for things with fresh eyes can be a really good way to identify potential sources of problems. And we'll talk a little bit about what those might be and what you might see when you're walking through with fresh eyes. Next slide. What the CDC tells us, and by the way, when you go to the CDC hazard assessment, it's actually going to send you to OSHA and give you their recommendations, which is analyzing the cleaning services you have, the disinfecting services, and the air ventilation and filtration system. So this is something, the air ventilation and filtration, you're probably going to need somebody who's an expert, but that could be your landlord. It could be the people who do the building maintenance if you're in a big building. Whereas cleaning services, it might be you as the person who is the owner or manager of the company who's doing the cleaning. Next slide. So cleaning and disinfecting. What do you have to do? And what's the best practice? Well, cleaning is good, right? COVID or not, these are all really good tips. Every day we should be cleaning. What the state says as the requirement, the mandatory piece of what businesses need to do is that they need to clean at least after every shift, daily, or more frequently as needed. So what does that mean? It means somebody should be doing the cleaning every day. It means disinfecting of shared objects, treating high transit areas, in particular the bathroom and other common areas, on a regular basis. So you can do it a number of ways. It doesn't say you have to hire a professional cleaner or pay somebody to do this, but someone in your office needs to be the person who is responsible for it, right? So you have to designate who that is. And, you know, I know a lot of us, you don't want to be that person. Some of us do. Some of us love the cleaning so much that we are so militant that we want to be the cleaning person in the office. But it's got to be somebody who's there every day. There's got to be a backup if that person isn't there. You can also supply products so people can clean as they go, having disinfectant wipes near those high traffic areas, near the copy machine, right? So that after you leave the copy machine, it can get wiped down, right? That is a method of cleaning and disinfecting. But we need to know this is happening on a daily basis, at least a daily basis. And the state says you got to keep a log of it. You got to log how frequently this cleaning is being done and how. And that's just on a regular basis. If you know that there is an exposure in the workplace, the CDC has some guidance on this as well. So that's like you have an employee who comes in and they say I've tested positive, or, you know, I just found out that I'm having these symptoms, or you're sending someone home, you're worried about an exposure that could make other people sick. Can you do the cleaning yourself? Yes. The CDC actually tells you to wait a little while if you're doing it yourself because they don't want you to touch a surface with a germ on it. You know, they don't want you to knowingly go in and be like, oh, I'm going to clean this person's office 1 minute after they left, and now I'm touching all the stuff they touched and I'm getting sick, right? So they tell you to wait 24 hours. And you can do it yourself. You can have your regular cleaners do it, or you can call in a professional. I know calling in a professional, and depends on the size of your work site, like a law firm, a small office building is going to be a different type of expense than a 100,000 square feet manufacturing facility. But calling in a professional has a ton of benefits. One, you don't have to touch the stuff yourself. For those of us who are somewhat of germ phobes, yeah, I'd much rather, if I know that there's an exposure, have a pro do it. Second, it's a best practice. They know what they're doing. They're wearing their gloves the correct way. They're less risk of exposure to themselves. And third, it's good PR for you. It looks good for you to your other employees as an employer if you're taking it so seriously that you're having a professional clean done. And then you can, Erin and Lisa are going to talk a little bit about notices that you provide to employees if there has been an exposure in your workplace. So you can explain to them, these are the steps we took, including having it professionally cleaned. That looks really good. Is it required? No. Cleaning is required. Professional cleaning is not, but it's highly, highly recommended. The state also says that you have to follow the requirements that are put out by the CDC and the New York State Department of Health for cleaning and sanitization. So some of you who, if you're a news junkie like me and you stay up all night watching every news channel, you hear these things that come out like the CDC says, oh, it turns out this maybe doesn't live on surfaces as long as we thought it did. And you're like, what? Like, I thought we were talking 72 hours, 48 hours, 24 hours. I thought stainless steel was the worst, you know? And what they're really saying is, yeah, we don't really know. We don't know for sure. And what we do know is, of course, the droplets in the air, that person to person, is going to give you a greater risk of exposure. But just because CDC now said yesterday it might not live on surfaces, it might not be that bad from surfaces, does not change anything with respect to what New York State is telling us we have to do. So when you look on the New York State website, it's going to tell you to follow the recommendations from CDC and the New York State Department of Health. And then, as I mentioned, you have to maintain these cleaning logs of the date, time, and scope of cleaning. So someone has to be responsible to clean, to write down that they've cleaned, and to keep the logs that they've cleaned. Now, how are you going to have to prove this? Well, hopefully never. Hopefully nobody's ever going to come in and ask you for your logs. But could they? For sure they could. Somebody could complain about you. It could be a disgruntled employee. It could be a vendor. It could be a customer. It could be someone who comes in your office. If they make a complaint and the local departments end up coming out, you may have to show your logs. So you want to make sure that you have them in some fashion. They can be electronic. They can be paper. They don't tell you the form your logs have to take. You just have to be able to pull them up. So making an easy sort of checklist for somebody would probably be a great way to do it. Hand hygiene, obviously, we know is so important, having hand hygiene stations throughout the office. Soap and water is great. We know we have restrooms and kitchens, but also just putting bottles of hand sanitizer everywhere. It looks like we are no longer in a hand sanitizer deficit. We're not in a desert anymore here in Western New York, so you can get it. Put it everywhere. Put it by all the common areas. And then document where you put it. Ventilation. We know ventilation is really important. Some of us who are, oh, I guess here's another thing I'm not an expert in, HVAC. I don't really know how this works. What I'm hearing though is air conditioning is kind of bad for spreading this. Anything that's blowing the virus around is bad. So windows open, if that's a possibility, is probably better. But really talking to somebody who knows this kind of thing is very important. Something else, this is really not so much cleaning and disinfecting, but who worked in an office where people were always bringing in food, right? Yeah, not so much anymore with the food. Like, cut it out. Maybe that's how we lose our COVID-19, if our offices no longer have the kitchen displays. But right now, it's not that we're really worried about COVID being food-borne as much as the stuff, like the plates that you're bringing in. Everybody's touching all the same stuff. And you know always the one person in the office who cuts half the donut and touches it with their hands and leaves the other. Yeah. So no more of that for a little while. Next slide. So the New York plan, where do you find it? Forward.ny.gov. And then you click on industry guidance, and Erin's gonna actually go over these in more detail, but here's the deal. Phase 1, they're all listed. Essential businesses. What it says about essential businesses is if you're essential, so you're already operating. Even before phase 1 started, you were operating. You need to follow the guidance now. The guidance says you have to read the summary guidance, you have to create a safety plan, and then you have to click on another website through the state and affirm to the state that you have prepared the safety plan. So if you're essential, this should already be done. Now, realistically, the guidance just came out, and the weird things in my mind are, well, what if I'm like the type of business that's a phase 2, like a professional service business, but I'm essential, so I've already been operating, so I don't know what the guidance is gonna say for phase 2. I still think we have to already have the plans in place. So we should do our best following a phase 1 template that is most similar. And then when the phase 2 guidance comes out, we can always update it. So if we look on that forward.ny.gov, click on the industries, you'll see a few right now. There's like manufacturing, retail, construction. So look at the guidance for phase 1, and hopefully, I mean, we were really thinking this week we'd start seeing some phase 2 guidance. But hopefully it'll be really soon. There's summary guidance. They give you a template of the plan, and then they tell you where to go to affirm that you have created the plan. Now, you don't submit the plan. You keep the plan for you. You keep it in your own files. You never have to show it to anyone unless there's a complaint and someone comes in and asks you for it. Anybody can ask you for it. It can be a member of your workforce. It could be a union. It could be a customer, a vendor. Anyone can ask you for it and got to show it. You can't, and it can be, if a complaint can be then made to the state, and state or local authorities will come in and say, okay, show me your plan. So you got to have it. And if you're signing the affirmation, you're swearing that you have one in place. Next slide. So what else can you do on site? Well, physical distancing, right? We all know it. We got to stay 6 feet away from each other. Is that reasonable to do? In some workplaces it is. In some it's not. So some workplaces are like, we all have our own offices. We're all going into our own offices and we're shutting our doors. So is that distance enough? For the most part, probably yes. But my guess is you all have a common entrance. You have a waiting area. You have a bathroom. You have a kitchen, a break room, a copy room, a mail room, places that you're going to be going into with other people. Those are high traffic areas. So the next question is face coverings. Do I have to provide face coverings? Yes, employers, you have to provide face coverings to your employees if they're public facing or if they can't maintain social distancing. So this gets a little wishy-washy. It's harder to understand when you're thinking like, I'm in my own office with my door shut. Nobody's ever gonna come near me, right? I'm maintaining my distancing. I still think we need the face coverings. My best recommendation is make sure your face coverings are available to your employees, because you never know who's gonna walk to the copy room at the same time as each other. So you can do things like the visual cues, like put little feet 6 feet away from the copier so people aren't standing on top of each other while they're waiting. The problem is, depending on how your copy room is set up, can somebody walk out while you're walking in and not get within 6 feet of each other? If not, really, you should be wearing a face covering. Face coverings have to be able to be disposed of if they're dirty and replaced by the employer. This is an employer obligation. Face coverings are really uncomfortable for some people. It's very, very difficult to breathe with them on for a lot of people. And you'll get some complaints about it. You'll probably get a lot of complaints about it. But they're extremely important. They have been demonstrated to really be incredibly effective. And they are a requirement. So make sure that you have them available. You're also going to want to look at the occupancy requirements and limitations that are put out by the state. Some industries, they are having like only a certain percentage of people are permitted in. I expect that in future retail operations and restaurants and stuff, there's going to be limitation on visitors as well. So you're going to want to look at the industry specific guidance and see who can be there at the same time. This might be a best practice too. And I'll just jump in and say, I've got some clients who are saying, hey, this remote thing is actually not so bad. It's actually working well for us. And we might be able to save some money on certain aspects of our business by letting people continue to work remotely. if it's working, let it work, right? And maybe it's that we have groups that come in Monday, Wednesday, Friday. We have groups that come in Tuesday, Thursday. We have a weekend on and off shift. Those sorts of things. If it's working for you, let it work and keep your occupancy lower. The fewer people in, the better. You're going to want to have rules for tightly confined spaces like your entryway, your elevators. So if you were in a building with elevators, there should be a rule about how many people can be on at the same time. I heard for the lawyers on the call, the court system has gone to only 4 people in an elevator at a time. Having been on the court's elevators, I don't really think that that's a whole heck of a lot of distance, but it can't be any worse than it used to be. So, but make sure you have rules for those spaces and communicate those rules. One great thing I'm seeing is the one-way path through the office, right? Make people walk a certain direction, especially if you're lucky enough to be in an office that has like a U shape or an O shape or a square, so that everybody walks in the same way. Put little feet and arrows on the ground for your visual cues so people aren't walking back and crossing paths with each other. They're staying away. Zoom it. Okay. Everybody's seen all the mugs and the t-shirts that say, I survived another meeting that could have been an email. And having survived many of those myself, I totally appreciate it. But if you don't have to meet in person, if there's not a reason you all physically have to be together, don't use Zoom. Model or Skype or whatever systems are available to you. You're better off doing it that way rather than in person if you can avoid it. Because otherwise people are all gonna have to sit in their masks in your conference room. Make sure you have designated pickup and delivery areas. Make sure you have plans for visitors. You have to keep visitor logs, and I think that Erin and Lisa will talk about that with the policy. But first of all, do you really need to have visitors at your office? Let's think about that. Is there a way to say nobody's coming in for a while? If so, keep the visitors out. If they're necessary, think about how you want to have them come in. A lot of what I see people doing is have people wait in their cars. Call them when you're ready, so there's not overlap between customers or visitors. Have designated areas for visitors to meet, and make sure that they sign in and follow that log. Next slide. Just a few more tips. The one that I think is most important is, attitude is everything, and modeling good behavior from the top down is really important. If you, as the person who is the manager, the partner, the owner, follows these rules, does not complain about face coverings, right? Changes their attitude, is an act of generosity. I'm lucky enough to be healthy enough to go outside, so I can do this for somebody else who is maybe not so lucky, right? If you change that attitude and that's how you're operating, it is going to have a good effect on your team members. Not coming in if you don't have to. I know that there are some lawyers on the call, so I'll tell you, a number of conversations about FaceTime and how it used to be so important to demonstrate FaceTime, and I'm here all the time, and we have mandatory Saturdays and all that good stuff, right? And the non-partners, the non-senior level people feel that way. They feel like they need to be seen. If you're modeling good behavior and we can still have meetings and we can still be productive, and presuming everyone still is productive, model that, do that. You work from home, you set up the Zoom meeting, you be sending out regular emails, and hopefully everybody else will want to do the same thing. Wear your masks without complaining. When you please do that. A lot of people have asked, where are the testing sites? If an employee comes to me and they're worried about an exposure, they've heard something, where do I send them? Well, you don't really send them anywhere, but the health department has a website that lists all the testing sites in Erie County. It makes it a little bit easier. Wearing a mask, really important. People screw this up all the time. You see people put on a mask and then all of a sudden after wearing it, they're touching the front of it. Well, if you're touching the front of it, you're touching all the droplets that have got on the front of your mask. That's not helpful. So the World Health Organization actually puts out a video, and it's probably easier to Google it than it is to type in this address, but if you type in World Health Organization, how to wear a mask, they have these cute little signs and short videos you can watch. Same thing with wearing gloves. Gloves can be a great tool, especially when you're cleaning, but not if you're touching your cell phone, touching your face, touching with the dirty surfaces that you just touched with your gloves. So I encourage you to go on the World Health Organization site and look at the how to use gloves site as well. I think that's the last of my slides. I'm going to ask Erin to flip to the next one. I'm going to turn it over to Lisa Coppola.
Right, and so I'm going to talk specifically about your people and how to deal with them, right? If you're essential, how you've been dealing with them all along. And if you're in one of these new reopening phases, what to think about. Next slide. The first thing I want you to think about, if you would, is the health issue, right? That's everything we're talking about is COVID and how to keep people healthy. And Erin will talk, I think, in more detail when she talks about the safety plan template New York State has issued, at least in phase 1. But you need to think about and start performing health assessments on a daily basis. And do you have to hire a nurse? No, you don't have to hire a nurse. Do you have to do the temperature check when the individuals walk in the door to your office or your plant? No, you don't. You have to decide that based on the risks and the circumstances of your business. But does an assessment need to be done? The answer to that is yes, should be done. And alongside of that is what happens to either that electronic document, if you have people keying it in from their smartphones or from their laptops, or what happens to the physical piece of paper if you have a checkbox asking things like, have you had any of the following symptoms, right? The COVID symptoms we've all heard about ad nauseum. Or have you been in contact with somebody who is known to have an exposure? Or have you had a COVID test? Or have you traveled outside of the area in the last 14 days? Those are, generally speaking, the top questions to ask. But what do you do with the answers? Somebody must be designated. And we would say it should be one individual with a need to know basis. No one else should have these records. This is private information. People throw around the term HIPAA, right? When we talk about medical information. Well, if you're not a HIPAA related entity, there's not a HIPAA violation, but is there a privacy violation? If you start talking about how Joe Smith said his wife was exposed to COVID by her sister-in-law, that's arguably a privacy violation. So you need to have one responsible individual. Oftentimes it's somebody in the human resources department, but it doesn't have to be. It just needs to be somebody who's trustworthy, who reviews these assessments contemporaneously when they're done. Because if somebody comes in and says they have a symptom, you don't want them staying on site. And you need to maintain these records in a place that's private and secure. And then next slide, we'll talk about what happens, right? What happens if there is a worrisome answer on one of these assessments? Or what happens if during a shift, somebody starts exhibiting symptoms of known symptoms of COVID? You know, somebody's coughing a lot. Somebody's looking as though he or she has a fever or starts complaining about fever. What do you need to do? Well, there needs to be one individual who's your COVID coordinator at work who has a set plan, and that's part of this safety plan template that Erin will talk about in a moment. That person is the one to whom this information is reported and who is empowered to make the decisions that need to be made, right? One of the most important things that we're talking to our clients about is having a communication plan. So let's say, you know, my proverbial Joe Smith either has answered that he's experiencing some COVID symptoms or starts to develop and reveal those kinds of symptoms during the course of the workday. Well, Joe Smith needs to go home right away and be told, go see a medical professional or contact your provider right away. What do you do with the rest of your staff? Well, that depends on the circumstances. And that's why we want you to think about this in advance. So if you're a business that's reopening, either now in phase 1 or you're anticipating, you know, another week or so, phase 2, 3, and 4 throughout the course of the next few weeks, think about this now. What's your communication going to be to the coworkers? We argue you need to advise everybody that there's a possible exposure. You do not advise who it is. Some of you may say, well, I run a small workforce. If Joe Smith goes home, everybody's going to know it's Joe Smith. Well, while that might be the case, it is not the employer's role to identify Joe Smith ever. But it is the employer's role to warn employees and to identify who's been in close and persistent contact with our proverbial Joe Smith, so that those individuals can be warned. And in most cases, all of those individuals should be sent home. And Jen talked about this a bit with the physical plant, right? The physical plant needs to be cleaned. So that's a really important, right? Some of us say, what do you mean? We have to send everybody home. Well, that'll grind our business to a halt. The answer to that, on the other side of that coin is public health. You don't want, as an employer, to continue your operations, to have a number of your individuals fall ill, potentially. You don't want to be reported as an irresponsible employer and either have a local police authority or a Department of Labor investigator showing up or sending you a questionnaire because there's been a tipster out there. Next slide. So, so that action plan is very important. Jen talked about some of these issues, so I'm not going to belabor them, but these, these have to do with your people, right? Keeping a very high and thorough process of sanitization or disinfecting. What we see a lot is, well, how do we know the person is really sick? How do we know that that sore throat they've called in with isn't just, allergies? It's springtime in Buffalo, right? There's pollen flying around. Well, we don't know. We don't know for sure. And that's one of the reasons why we encourage employees who reveal one or more of the symptoms of COVID to see their providers right away. Next slide. So the other thing we've got to talk about, and Jen hit it on physical plant as well, is the whole issue of visitors. You're going to see with the New York State template plan that you've got to log all of these people. You've got to log your own employees. You've got to log every visitor. Arguably, the UPS person who shows up has got to be logged, which seems remarkable because we want to keep our distance from everybody. But at least there's got to be a notation about who has come on your site and when and where they were. That's for a later issue of contact tracing if that becomes an issue. Next slide. So all of these issues around COVID are governed by a number of different laws. We're not going to take a deep dive into laws because, one, they're changing all the time, and two, then we'll sound like really boring lawyers, and we try very hard not to. You should be talking to your own counsel, or you should feel free to contact us, but there is this overlap. We're in, for purposes of our employees, an overlapping situation between federal law and state law. It's always been that way in the employment context, and it continues to be that way now. So much of what we're focusing on is from the New York State Department of Labor. It's enforcing much of the governor's guidance. He's using executive orders to create things that have the effect of law without going through the legislative process because we have this public health emergency. So we've got New York State and the Department of Labor. We also have some federal agencies. We have a federal Department of Labor. Jen mentioned the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control. We put on this slide the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. And then also OSHA. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration has a role here too with respect to safe workplaces. Next slide. So I want to talk, I said the EEOC, right? I want to talk for a couple of minutes about protected classes. This is something we talk about all the time in the realm of discrimination. It is related to COVID now in a way that's even more acute, if you can believe it, from the employer perspective. Next slide. So protected classes are immutable characteristics. Something immutable just means you can't change it, right? You can't change the fact that I have Caucasian skin. A characteristic that the law protects and that employers cannot make decisions on account of. There are classes that are protected both under federal law and under state law. State law's protections here in New York and in California, but certainly where we are in New York, are broader than the federal classifications for protections for workers and people in other contexts. Some you might not know about. Familial status, right? That's whether somebody has a family or doesn't have a family. You can't make decisions, employment decisions, including COVID-related decisions, on that basis. Domestic violence victim status, right? That seems unusual, but there was some legislation a number of years ago recognizing that domestic violence victims often had to go to court, and that they were finding themselves at odds with their employers, needing to leave the office or the plant or the work site for these court appearances and for other reasons relating to their status as a domestic violence victim. And so the law now protects individuals who have that sort of history of being a victim. Sexual identity and sexual orientation are other protected classes. Next slide. And then there are the very, what I would say, the standard classifications we've all known about since the federal law called Title VII was promulgated decades ago, literally, right? Age, disability, if somebody has an underlying medical condition, pregnancy, national origin, race and ethnicity. This is not the sum total. I don't want to leave you with a misapprehension that, well, if I check all of these and I'm not focused on one of these classifications as the employer, I'm okay. I can't tell you that. There's a laundry list. You can Google protected classes and find them, or you can talk to your neighborhood friendly lawyer who does employment law work to tell you what those are. Suffice it to say, confer with your human resources professionals, confer with your attorneys whenever you're making a decision that might implicate a protected class. So next slide. The kind of decision, when I said that might implicate a protected class, the kind of decision we look at as lawyers doing employment law work. And again, I know this is a webinar about COVID reopening, but this plays into it in a significant way. If we make decisions that are called in the law adverse employment actions, and essentially the sum total of an adverse employment action includes a refusal to hire, right? Not hiring somebody because of a protected class. Well, I'm not going to hire her because she's 67 and that's too old for our workplace. That's discrimination. Terminating somebody on account of their protected class. This isn't a situation where somebody's not doing their job properly and they're terminated because of that. This is their, I'm just going to use the example of age again. Their age was a substantial motivating factor in why their employer terminated them. And then the other adverse employment action that can be a little bit of a gray area, and so we always want to point it out to get people thinking about this, is if you remove as an employer an advantage or a preference of the individual's job. Best example I can give is an employee working first shift and the employer decides to move that person to second or third shift, which generally speaking, and I know this is a generality, is not as preferred. If that decision is made because of the individual's protected classification, right? I don't want the oldsters here during the day, right? Then that is an act, arguably an act of discrimination that you need to be just aware of generally. Next slide. So how does this relate to COVID-19 and coming back to work, reopening our workplaces, or if we're essential, continuing our work? there are some examples that I just want to raise for you because for most of us, and right, we're Buffalo, we're the city of good neighbors. Many of us, I dare say the vast majority of us in Western New York care deeply about other people, right? But our caring can go too far when we're in a workplace setting. So here's the first example. If you have a pregnant employee and you're reopening and you're thinking to yourself, my goodness, I don't want the pregnant woman to come back to work. She must be vulnerable. I don't want to risk her exposure to COVID. That may actually be a discriminatory act because you're making a decision. Although you have a good heart behind your decision, you're making a decision based on her element or classification of something that the law says you can't make decisions about for the workplace. Next slide. Here's another example. What if you haven't, and we've seen this a lot in the popular press, right? What if you have somebody with an underlying health condition? I use the example chemotherapy treatment, but it could be autoimmune conditions. It could be any number, pre-existing heart disease, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. You know, there are all these underlying health conditions that we know from the scientists put individuals at a greater risk of either contracting COVID-19 or having a worse outcome and possibly even death if they contract COVID-19. And so can you as an employer make the decision autonomously on your own when you have somebody with an underlying medical condition? In other words, saying, well, the person who's been having chemo, I'm not going to bring them back to the workplace. That would be another instance, arguably, of discrimination because you're relying on their medical condition. Now, if they come to you and ask that question, it's a different story. That's when you engage in something we call the interactive process and try to find, is there a reasonable accommodation? Maybe they've been working from home perfectly. They ask, can I continue to work at home because I'm worried about my own health? You as the employer have an obligation to provide them a reasonable accommodation in most circumstances. And that might be, sure, stay at home. But should you initiate that conversation yourself as the employer? The answer to that question is no. Next slide. Here's another example. We hear this a lot. You know, we're not only the city of good neighbors, but we're the city of tough cookies. We've got a lot of folks who are over the age of 65, over the age of 70, who are still coming out to the workforce. You have to be very careful. You can't make decisions about your employees who are elderly, not coming back to work simply on the basis of their age. Next slide. And then finally, there are some other circumstances that might exist, right? You know, I heard this example from a client. Somebody was coughing a lot in the workplace and other coworkers were concerned about it, right? Cough is one of those symptoms of COVID. But it turns out the individual was taking some medication that was a side effect of. And so the client was asking these questions about, well, how do I ask these questions? Isn't that intrusive? These are areas where you have to very carefully tread. And I can't give you a hard and fast rule about this in every case. But I do want to say to you, talk with and consult with your human resources department, your HR professionals, or your legal counsel, because you don't want to inadvertently walk yourself into a claim from employees that, hey, my employer discriminated against me because I'm old, or because I have cancer, or because I take blood pressure medication, right? Next slide. And here's the point at which I'm going to turn this over to Erin Ewell from our office. She's going to talk specifically about policies, you know, really bring it home and what New York State requires of all of us who are running businesses. Erin?
All right. Hello, everyone. So at this point in the presentation, I have to ask you all, who is feeling like completely overwhelmed? You can't see me raising my hand because of my background. There is so much information coming at us, whether it's from the CDC, from the news media, from OSHA, from New York State, from the governor's daily press conferences. it's a lot of information to process. And so if you're feeling overwhelmed, I'm with you, and I'm going to tell you how we at the Coppola Firm are keeping up and how we're helping our clients keep up with information that seems to change almost daily. So all of the great information that we covered today, it's all super important. It's all steps that you need to take to keep your business safe and to comply with New York law. But there's this practical question sitting in the background, which is, how the heck are you going to keep up with all of this? How are you going to make sure that you're doing everything that you need to do to comply with the law and to keep your workers safe? So the answer to that question is, step one, you're going to take a look at your existing policies. And step two, you're going to update them to make sure that you have a policy in place or a plan in place. We kind of use plan and policy interchangeably, but you want to have policies that document what your plan is and create a clear communication across the board, across your business, so that when something happens, there's a policy that you can look to and you know exactly what to do. So I'm going to buzz through these quickly. Obviously, we can't go through the content of each of these policies in this webinar today, but here are the things that you should be looking for when you pull out your employee handbook, when you pull out your workplace policies. You want to make sure that you have a written communication to your workforce about all of the great steps about the physical workspace and keeping the people safe with social distancing, wearing masks, whatever it might be. So policies that you want to keep an eye out for when you're looking at your employee handbook are reporting symptoms. So you want to communicate to your employees, what symptoms are we worried about? And we want to communicate that if someone has those symptoms or observes someone in the workplace with those symptoms, they need to be reported, and we need to instruct people where to make that report. You want to have a policy about how you're going to promote social distancing, a policy that encourages regular hand washing, a policy about equipment sharing. So there's some different workplace safety standards that are going to come into play from OSHA. That's going to be very industry specific. But then the final policy I want you to consider is how you're going to stagger or modify your shifts. So you might put together a plan to ensure that you have less people in your office or in your workplace on a certain day of the week by saying, you know, list one of employees comes in on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, the other list comes in Thursday, Friday, whatever it might be. But all of these plans and steps will not be effective or useful unless you clearly communicate them to your staff. So if that wasn't enough, you know, we had 5 or so policies on the other page. There's several other policies that we think are very important and that we are working with our clients to put in place. And if at any point as you're reading through this list, it kind of looks like alphabet soup. I know there's probably 5 or 6 different acronyms on this page. If you're looking at this and it looks like a foreign language, I encourage you to go on our firm's website. It's coppola-firm.com. We have a COVID-19 tab where we have blogged about each of these new state and federal laws as they've come out, and we've tried to break it down for everyone in a really straightforward and user-friendly way so that you know, okay, what is the FFCRA? Oh, that stands for this law, and it means that employees get to take leave, possibly paid leave, under certain circumstances. But throughout this list, these are all policies that you're going to need to consider whether they will benefit your workplace, or if they apply to your workplace, they're policies that you really need to have in place. Without going into too much detail, I just want to highlight a couple of things that everyone who has a business needs to be thinking about, and that's particularly sick leave. In New York State, we have a brand new law that will be requiring employers to provide paid sick leave to employees. That law will go into effect on January 1st of 2020, but the way that employees will start to accrue their paid or unpaid sick leave starts up this September. So while everyone is overwhelmed dealing with coronavirus and getting their employees back to work safely, you also need to know that there's this state law floating in the background, getting closer and closer, and you'll need to have a policy in place for that to communicate to employees what leave they will have available and how that leave is going to interact with your other policies. So I'm not going to go through each of these one by one because I want to be respectful of everyone's time, but I want to leave you with just an important thing to think about, and that's it's easy to pull a policy, like any number of these policies. You can probably find a template online. I strongly encourage you to speak with your lawyer or your HR professional about these policies, because while it might seem that they stand alone on a piece of paper, they all interact together. So for example, your COVID-19 sick leave policy is going to interact with your PTO policy. Those are going to overlap with FMLA. They're going to overlap with your paid family leave policy. They're going to overlap with your Families First Coronavirus Response Act policy. And it sounds scary when you say all that together, but it really does take some careful thought when you are creating these policies, because you want to protect your employees' rights. You want to give them the benefits that they're afforded under the law. But as the employer, you also want to make sure you're doing what you need to, but make sure that you have policies that talk to each other and that work together so that you don't end up in an even trickier situation or even opening yourself up to liability down the road because you didn't take the time to think about how these different laws and different policies interact together. So what we're doing at our firm for a lot of different businesses is what we call the Return to Work Toolkit. There is no one toolkit for every business out there. Anyone who tells you that is giving you bad information. What we'll go through in a second is the guidance that we have from New York State, but you'll also see, if you're following the CDC and OSHA, they are giving out, they're mandating that different industries take different steps to keep their workforce safe. So there's no return to work toolkit that is one size fits all for businesses. But here at our firm, we are creating toolkits of policies to make sure that your business is checking every box that it needs to for your specific industry.
Just real quick, while Erin is still talking, if people have questions, you want to throw them in the chat box. I'll try to look at them and ask them of Erin. We already had one question come in that Lisa already answered, but Erin's going to keep going. But if you guys have things specifically in mind, shoot them in the chat box and I'll be happy, or you can either do it privately to me, Jennifer Scharf, or to everyone, and we'll make sure they get asked. Thanks.
That is awesome. And I have my PowerPoint up on the screen, so unfortunately I'm not able to see the chat box. So if there's anything you want to, feel free to interrupt me. So this is sort of a sneak peek of one of the sort of instructive policies that we're giving out to our clients. And we're actually going to provide this checklist to all of you as friends of the firm for attending this webinar. But what we've created as best we can is condensing all of this information onto one page, and it'll prompt you to think about everything that you need to think about in order to get your workplace ready to reopen safely and in compliance with New York and federal law. So it might not be everything. You'll see some of these checkboxes say, okay, now you have to go look at the CDC website and you need to make sure that you're complying with your industry requirements, but it will prompt you to do everything that you need to do to get back to work safely. Okay, so lastly, I just want to take a little bit of time to show you the New York Forward website. Hopefully you've seen it already. If you haven't, this is New York Forward. It's a website that is designed specifically to instruct businesses through the process of getting back to work, getting back to reopening, getting back to business. What you care a lot about, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but it's circled in red here, is the industry specific guidance. When you click on that tab, you will see that for each phase, there is industry specific guidance for the industries that are impacted at each phase. So I think Jen mentioned we're hoping to see guidance for phase 2. I think a lot of us on this call will fall into phase 2. Unfortunately, we don't have it yet. We've been telling folks to look to the industry that is most similar to yours for now to get a sense of what the state will require from you, but you should feel free to keep checking back into this website, or even if you're following the Coppola Firm on social media, I'm sure we'll have a post out as soon as phase 2 information is available. We'll have a post up to say, hey, check out the website. It's finally there. You can take a look at what the state is saying we need to do. Once
You know, Erin, there is a question that just popped up regarding bringing staff back. What
Mhm.
does consider any employees who are legally required to be reinstated mean? I think that that is reference to like unionized employees, collective bargaining agreements.
Yeah, and
Um,
possibly from a word that's mentioned on our checklist. And the reason we say that circles back because all of this stuff is interrelated and it gets really complicated. Lisa spent some time talking about the state and federal laws that come into play when you're bringing folks back. You want to be particularly mindful, especially if you're bringing back some folks and not others, about whether an employee has a legal right to return to work. So one federal statute that comes to mind is FMLA. You might have an employee who is out on FMLA leave or became eligible for FMLA during this shutdown, and they have a legal right to have their position reinstated when they've exhausted that FMLA leave. So that's one of many examples, but it goes to show that you need to be careful and you need to be strategic, and really you want to get some professional HR or legal guidance when you're making these decisions about who comes back and who doesn't. Okay, so once you find the industry that's most similar to yours, and like I said, hopefully we'll get the phase 2 guidance soon and you'll be able to find the guidance for your industry, you'll see that this New York Forward website has summary guidelines. It has more detailed guidelines that you're going to need to affirm that you have a plan to comply with, and a template that you can use to begin creating your safety plan. I'll look super quickly at what is available, but you'll see these are sort of the overview guidelines, and there's both mandatory and recommended best practices. These are, some of them are overlap between industry, some of them don't. You're going to need to check back and find this guidance specific to your industry. There's also a very detailed, this document is actually 9 pages that goes through expectations industry by industry. So you're going to want to read through that. And finally, there's a safety plan template that is available to you, and it will prompt you to start thinking about how you can comply with all of these mandatory and suggested requirements. So I don't know if it appears on the page that I happen to screenshot. Again, the safety plan is pretty lengthy, but one of the questions that we keep hearing is this requirement to log visitors to the workplace. You'll see that when you go through the safety plan document that it's one of the scenarios that's contemplated by New York State, and the state wants you to have a plan in place about how you're going to log visitors. So the sort of last piece of information I'll leave you with is the way that you're going to answer these questions is really through the policies that you put in place. So I encourage you all to be thoughtful about the policies that you roll out in order to comply with the New York requirements. Make sure that they're communicated clearly, make sure they're practical, there's something that you can comply with, and then make sure that they're followed across the board in your workplace. But ultimately, those policies will be the answers that you can use to create your safety plan. And then a reminder, as Jen said, this is a plan that will be internal to you. But that doesn't mean it's optional, because there's always the chance that if you were to get audited, the state or the Department of Labor will be asking for this plan that you're required to put in place, whether you have it and what it contains.
Thanks, Erin. We have another question that we're hearing a lot of, and I think any of us can jump in on this one, but how do you overcome the fact that some employees are getting more on unemployment and maybe don't want to come back?
Are you giving that question to me? Give it to Lisa. There's no good answer to that question.
There isn't a good answer. There really isn't. So, you know, we all know that dichotomy between employees who are making more on unemployment because of the federal stipend and whom we want to come back to work, right? We've had some clients who are using a strategy that they have sought and obtained Paycheck Protection Program funds, which 75% of which need to be paid to employees for wages. They've actually increased wages for some period of time, the 8 weeks after they've been dispersed those funds. Other employers have documented, and this is very important for the forgiveness part of the Paycheck Protection Program, but also could be helpful even if you don't have PPP money, have documented the return to work invitation. And when their employee says, no, I'm making more on unemployment, they've documented that as well. That gives the employer the right to protest the unemployment. We all have our own views about what that does to workplace morale if the individual comes back, but you as an employer are within your rights to tell an employee that if they do not return to work, that it may affect their unemployment compensation benefits. Is that a tacit threat? I wouldn't call it that. It is the fact, and you may choose to use that as a strategy. But is there a perfect solution to this dilemma? There is not.
All right. Any other questions before we sign off? We have just about a minute. If anyone has one, you can either chime in or write in the chat box.
I have a question that's been sent to me, and I'm gonna make it generic, right? If you're in an industry that's a very broad industry or may cover a number of different industries, like maybe part of your work is in one category, part is in another category. The question is, how do you know what phase you're in? And I think the answer to that is you have to make an assessment as best you can where the bulk of your work or your revenue falls, and you'd at least have a good faith basis to make the argument that you've fallen into that phase versus having to wait until the very end. The other thing you can do is you can make inquiry at ESD. And that's the governor's agency that is providing guidance on what essential businesses are. I can't guarantee you will get an answer from them. And Jen might suggest too that you make inquiry of your state legislator. This is part of constituent service, contacting your state legislator and saying, listen, I'm not clear what phase I'm in. Can you get guidance from the governor's office for me? What do you think about that?
I think that's a great idea, and that is something that I am definitely prone to doing. And the other thing is, best, safest practice I would say is assume you're in the earliest phase and have your plans ready with the earliest phase possible, or act like you're, the essential businesses already have to have everything done with phase one. So let's assume let's get your plans ready. As when you look at the guidance as between manufacturing and retail, is there a little bit of difference? Sure, because the retail has this whole like curbside pickup thing going on, which isn't really relevant to manufacturing. But generally speaking, the requirements, the distancing, the hand hygiene, the cleaning and disinfecting, like that stuff is pretty consistent as between industries. So probably you can make sense of what your business overall has to do. So start doing it now. It's going to get you into the right habit of doing it, and consult with your lawyers.